Why do humans constantly search for meaning while repeatedly overlooking what is directly beneath their awareness? This question reveals a subtle but persistent paradox in modern life. People invest enormous effort in acquiring knowledge, experiences, and explanations. They pursue insight through complexity, novelty, and increasingly sophisticated external systems. Yet, at the same time, the most fundamental structures of experience remain unnoticed. What is closest to awareness is often what is least examined. Modern cognition tends to equate depth with difficulty. We assume that something meaningful must be hidden, distant, abstract, or technically complex. If an insight is easily accessible, it is assumed to be superficial. As a result, attention is consistently directed outward toward theories, frameworks, identities, and future outcomes, while immediate experience is treated as background noise. The central claim explored in this lecture challenges that assumption. Ibn Arabi argues that the deepest realities are not concealed in distant metaphysical realms. They are structurally present within ordinary experience, yet cognitively bypassed. This is not mystical symbolism or poetic exaggeration. It is a precise examination of attention, perception, and what can be called epistemic blindness, the failure to notice what continuously supports awareness itself from a psychological perspective. Modern life produces a specific form of perceptual neglect. Chronic stress, constant stimulation, and cognitive overload fragment attention. The mind becomes oriented toward urgency rather than presence. Cognitive science describes several mechanisms that reinforce this condition. Attention bias directs focus toward novelty, threat, or reward. Habituation reduces sensitivity to constant features of experience, no matter how essential they are. At the neural level, the default mode network becomes dominant, generating continuous self-referential thought planning, remembering, evaluating, and narrating. The consequence is subtle but profound. Individuals live on top of experience rather than within it. Presence is replaced by commentary. Perception gives way to prediction. Reality is filtered through usefulness and relevance rather than encountered directly. A contradiction emerges here. As access to information increases, sensitivity to immediate experience decreases. The more content the mind consumes, the less it registers what is actually happening. This creates a philosophical problem that cannot be solved by additional data. If depth exists within lived reality itself, why does it remain persistently overlooked? Ibn Arabi approached this problem not as a poet of abstraction, but as a metaphysician of perception. His central concern was how reality appears to consciousness, and why that appearance is so often mistaken for reality itself. Importantly, Ibn Arabi does not reject knowledge, reason, or cognition. Instead, he examines their structural limitations. He treats understanding as a filter rather than a mirror, something that organizes experience, but also constrains what can be seen. His diagnosis is direct. Reality is not shallow, fragmented, or empty of meaning. Human awareness fails to register its depth because perception becomes habitual. Consciousness learns to recognize patterns efficiently, and in doing so, it stops truly seeing. What makes Ibn Arabi particularly relevant today is that his framework anticipates several modern ideas: perceptual filtering, constructed experience, and observer-dependent meaning. He does not present a mystical escape from the world, but an analytical explanation of why the world, as it is lived, appears thinner than it actually is. One of Ibn Arabi's most important clarifications concerns the nature of depth itself. Depth is not a vertical dimension, nor a hidden layer behind appearances. It is not something added to reality. It is the ontological richness already present within immediacy. The common misconception is that depth requires transcendence, an escape from the ordinary into something extraordinary. As a result, everyday experience is treated as trivial, while meaning is projected elsewhere. Ibn Arabi reverses this assumption. He argues that the ordinary is already saturated with meaning. What limits awareness is not the absence of depth, but the selectivity of consciousness. The mind registers only what supports identity maintenance, prediction, and survival. From a cognitive science perspective, this aligns with the idea of perceptual compression. The brain reduces the richness of sensory input to maintain efficiency. What is constant becomes background. What is predictable becomes invisible. A simple example illustrates this clearly. Breathing is continuous, essential, and foundational to life. Yet it is almost entirely ignored until disrupted. Its importance does not increase when it becomes noticeable. Awareness simply returns to what was always there. The insight here is precise. What is most foundational becomes most invisible, not because it lacks depth, but because it never withdraws. Ibn Arabi identifies habitual perception as a greater obstacle to awareness than ignorance. Habit, or ADA, refers to automatic interpretation without fresh attention. It allows functioning, but it also dulls perception. Modern psychology describes this through predictive processing. The brain prioritizes expectation over sensation. Incoming information is compared to internal models, and anything that fits is quickly dismissed as already known. The consequence is that reality is encountered as confirmation rather than discovery. Experience does not reveal itself, it is merely matched against expectations. This is most visible in daily routines. Activities are performed efficiently, but not attentively. Time appears to pass without being lived. Days blur together not because nothing happened, but because perception was never fully engaged. It is important to clarify that habit is not inherently negative. It enables stability and survival. However, it is epistemically limiting. It narrows the bandwidth of awareness. Depth disappears, not because it vanishes, but because it becomes predictable. What no longer surprises the mind no longer registers as real. A further layer of this problem involves the structure of the self. Ibn Arabi observes that the self tends to narrate experience rather than inhabit it. Reality is continuously interpreted through identity maintenance. From his perspective, the ego does not encounter reality directly. It mediates experience through roles, goals, fears, and continuity. Attention is directed toward preserving a coherent self-story. Neuroscience offers a parallel explanation. When the default mode network dominates, attention shifts inward, toward autobiographical thought. Rumination, evaluation, and anticipation replace sensory presence. The result is familiar. You can be physically present in an environment while mentally absent. Experience continues, but awareness is displaced. Crucially, Ibn Arabi does not claim that the self intentionally blocks depth. The displacement is functional. The self prioritizes control and coherence over perception. Depth is not rejected. It is postponed indefinitely. At this point, a common misunderstanding must be addressed. Many assume that depth can be accessed through effortful seeking. Ibn Arabi explicitly challenges this. His paradox is simple: seeking depth externally increases distance from it. The more aggressively one tries to extract meaning, the more perception narrows. Cognitive science supports this logic. Excessive goal-directed attention reduces perceptual bandwidth. The mind becomes task-oriented rather than receptive. Depth does not emerge under pressure. It appears when perception stabilizes rather than accelerates. This leads to an important distinction. Stillness is not passivity. It is attentional receptivity, the capacity to register what is already present without immediately converting it into utility or hum narrative. When translated into modern terms, Ibn Arabi's insight is cognitive, not ritualistic. The application does not require belief, but adjustment of attention. One practical strategy is attentional deceleration, reducing task, switching, and allowing perception to complete itself. Another is sensory grounding, consciously re-anchoring awareness in immediate sensory data without interpretation. A third is metacognitive awareness, noticing when experience is being overlaid by narrative, judgment, or self-story. Research on mindfulness supports these practices, not as spiritual techniques, but as mechanisms for increasing perceptual clarity. Reduced dominance of the default mode network is associated with improved emotional regulation and attentional stability. The purpose is not self-improvement or optimization. It is the restoration of contact with lived reality as it is, rather than as it is continuously interpreted. The central insight of this lecture is precise. Depth is not absent. It is consistently bypassed. Ibn Arabi offers a diagnosis of perceptual neglect, not metaphysical scarcity. Reality does not withhold its richness. Awareness simply stops registering. What never leaves. What is constantly beneath awareness becomes invisible, not because it lacks depth, but because it supports everything else without interruption. Understanding, in this framework, does not always require adding knowledge. Sometimes it requires removing the habits of attention that prevent noticing. Depth is not something you must reach. It is something you must stop walking over.